And get started. My name is Hilary Stoupa. I'm an InfoPath developer with Qdabra software, and today we're going to talk about some things you can do in your forms with XPath. To start with, if we take a look at my greeting bubble that I've got over my picture there, you'll notice I'm using XPath, and if you read that XPath, you'll see that what I'm doing is I'm selecting all greeting nodes that have a value of hello. We can see we've got the little dot syntax to refer to the self node of greeting. So the XPath leads to the greeting node, and then we refer in our filter, we've got square brackets around that, we refer to the greeting node itself, and we're finding ones with the value of hello. Because my text string there starts with a capital H, this is only going to match greeting nodes that begin with the word hello that's capitalized in the same manner this is, since XPath and XML are case sensitive, as I'm sure you guys have all found out before. Most of us learn that kind of the hard way, and we gradually become very case sensitive. Nowadays I just say that I'm case sensitive because I've worked with C# and XML so much. These are just the basics. I'll try to stick kind of within this time frame. I can tend to be a little long-winded. I get sort of excited about some of this stuff, but I'll try to keep the demo down to about 20 minutes, and then we'll have some time for questions and answers. So first, let's talk about what XPath is. XPath stands for XML path, and it's a query language to allow you to select nodes from XML, and it can also be used to compute values from the content of the XML. And as you know, in InfoPath, we've got some functions like position or last that we can also use. InfoPath uses XPath 1.0, and if you use and publish and develop browser forms at all, you'll understand that the functions available in the browser are a subset of what's available for you in InfoPath Filler. So again, things like position, last. I found in InfoPath Form Services 2007 that even though when you're developing a form, it won't tell you that the number function isn't supported, the number function is not supported. So things like that are in kind of the live and learn realm, and you definitely, if you're working with a browser form, want to publish often, test often because of things like this. And there's additional functions in XPath 2.0 that would be lovely to have in InfoPath, but again, XPath 1.0 is the specification currently in use. So let's talk about relative versus absolute XPath. If you've done any web work at all, any work with websites, you'll understand the difference between a relative and an absolute URL. An absolute URL when you're online is when we include the entire link, https:// my server name / etc. A relative URL means relative to the page where I am, where will I find this resource? And it uses a notation very similar to what we would see in relative XPath. So I copied this in from the actual XPath specification. If you're ever having a hard time sleeping, I would highly recommend this document. It's very informative. It's slightly dry reading, but there's two kinds of location path, and that's what an XPath is at its heart. We're saying, here's where you find the node that I want, and there's relative and absolute location paths. A relative location path consists of a sequence of one or more steps separated by a /. The steps are composed together from left to right. Each step in turn selects a set of nodes relative to a context node. When you're writing a relative XPath, you're always starting from the node you are on. So if you're writing a custom condition for a rule expression, it's going to depend on the node you are setting the rule on. If you are writing some custom XPath condition for a button, it's going to depend on where that button is. Is it inside a section? You're going to be relative to the group that's bound to that section. Is it a repeating data structure, like a repeating row in a table? It's going to be relative to that row. An absolute location consists of a / followed by the rest of the location path. The / by itself selects the root of the document. So your full, complete, absolute XPath always starts at the document root and goes from there all the way down the tree. So to kind of get a better idea of that, let's look at some relative XPaths. So given this schema, which your schemas I know never look like, because you're always going to give your nodes meaningful names and you would never leave something named field 1, 2, 3, and 4, but one of my sample forms did, so forgive me my horrible form etiquette. If you placed a rule on field 1 that referred to field 2, so my rule's on field 1, it refers to field 2, the relative XPath would be ... / my field 2. That set of 2 dots, it takes you up the tree one step. I'm on field 1, ... takes me to my fields, and my field 2 takes me down to my field 2. In this instance, you could use an absolute XPath as well. But when we start looking at a repeating schema, given this schema where we've got the repeating sections group, if you place a rule on section name that refers to section percentage complete, the relative XPath would be ... / and then the node name. So from section name, we go up the tree to sections, and then we go back down to section percentage complete. And when I'm hand typing an XPath, if you were in my office with me, you would hear me saying up the tree, up the tree, up the tree each time I type 2 dots, because that's the only way I can kind of mentally picture what I need to write. So if we look at rating test here, this is a child of our, I don't think it's a child of our root node, I think it's a child of the audit node. What would the relative XPath be? And I had it here in my slide. There we go. And so it's my rating test, and you can see we go up the tree to sections. Oh, it is of the root node. We go up the tree to sections, up the tree to audit, up the tree to my fields, and then we select rating test. Hopefully that makes a little more sense than it sounds like it's making. If you need the full XPath to a node, you can copy it easily from the data source task pane. This was added in InfoPath 2007, and people who were writing for code everywhere rejoiced because it made it very simple for us to get the XPaths when we're selecting nodes programmatically. So if we look at the following schema, what would the result of these default values be? And hopefully you can see this. In this first formula box, I have put the entire path to question rating. Okay? And the result of this is going to be the sum. You can see maybe I've got a sum formula there. Is going to be the sum of all instances of question rating. Now in this formula, I'm using a relative XPath to get the sum of question ratings. You and I know that if I'm using a relative XPath, I'm only going to be selecting the question rating that's in the same group that I'm in. So at that point, a sum formula is kind of moot because it's going to get just this question's instance of question rating. So here I am on the total field. The full XPath to question rating, when used in an aggregation formula like sum, would get me back the sum of all the question ratings. But if I were using a relative XPath to question rating from my total field, it would get me back just that instance, just the one that's in the repeating node with me. Okay? Hopefully that makes sense. Learning XPath, lots of resources out there. The way I learned and the way I'm still learning is I use InfoPath. I'll change the first drop-down in a conditional formatting expression. You know, that first drop-down you're usually selecting a field. There's also the ability to select the expression. So I create my conditional format and then I select the expression and I see what InfoPath is using for the XPath. That's been a great learning tool for me. The other thing I use is in the formula editor, I check that little checkbox that says Edit XPath, and I take a look at those, and it has really helped me kind of understand how InfoPath is working with its secondary data sources to get back other values. It's helped me understand how to create my own XPath filters, because while the drop-downs in the conditional formatting box can do a lot for you, sometimes you have needs that are more complex than what's provided there. Here's some online resources. I particularly like this bottom one, and you'll see I've got a blog post too on InfoPath Dev that lists some of these. I'll show you this bottom one when we talk about another XPath expression further on, because there's some visuals there that I find extremely helpful. So we're going to go into a demo, and here's the stuff we're going to look at. And we're going to do some diagnostic stuff, finding out your form version and other information from your processing instructions. We'll look at a couple status samples, and these sample forms are going to be included with the webcast package, so you'll be able to look at the sample forms yourself. We're going to do a little bit of iteration using a double eval statement. I'm going to show you a trick for conditional defaults, and we'll talk briefly about repeating tables. So I'm going to try to cram as much as I can in the next 15 minutes, and I'm going to go ahead and share out my desktop now. I'm going to give this just a second. Hopefully this has resolved for everyone and you're seeing my screen. I have a form up. It's called Additional Demo. And the first thing we're going to look at here is getting form properties from the InfoPath processing instructions. Now, if you take a look at some sample XML that's been saved from an InfoPath form using a text editor like Notepad, you will see at the beginning of it some processing instructions. And this first batch is our InfoPath solution processing instruction. We have another batch here that's the application processing instruction. And if you're using other types of tools with InfoPath, you may have additional processing instructions. For example, if you were using, let me get this guy out of the way, if you were using Qdabra's DBXL, you would see some DBXL processing instructions. The syntax is the same for any processing instruction you wish to retrieve information from. And the only thing that would change here is the local name. And so in this case, we want the InfoPath solution processing instructions. If we wanted the Qdabra DBXL processing instructions, we'd replace what's in quotes here with Qdabra DBXL being, of course, case sensitive. Or we could replace it with InfoPath application. And what this particular formula here is going to do is return the entire MSO InfoPath solution processing instruction. And I'm going to preview this, and then I'm using substring formulas to get the version, the location, and in some cases the form name. So if we preview this, let me make this a little smaller. You can see here's my entire processing instructions. Using string functions, it's probably pretty apparent to you how you could get some of this different information back. For example, here in the form version, I'm using substring functions to return just the solution version. Here I'm using them to return just the file. Because this is a form in design mode that I'm previewing, it doesn't have a name in the processing instruction right now. If I were to open it directly from its published location, I might have to switch views here, we'll see. Go ahead and try to connect. Okay, so as you can see now, we do have a name attribute in our processing instructions, and my form name returns a value. So we'll just look at these formulas quickly. And here we have our first one. So this centerpiece looks familiar right here because we've just looked at that. That's the formula I'm using above to return everything. And here I'm saying I want the substring after solution version equals, which when we look at those we can see that there's an attribute that says solution version and then it has an equal sign. And then I want everything before my first quote mark. Let's take a look again and see how we're using substring after and before. Preview. And you can see we use substring after solution version to the quotes and substring before quotes. And now that's going to find the first instance of the quotes and return what's before it. Form version information can be extremely helpful to have at the bottom of your template. You know how InfoPath caches forms, and you'll have a user who calls you and says, oh, I thought you made this change to my form, and my form template doesn't have it. Or this form there's something wrong with it. And this can help you know whether or not your user is looking at a cached form version or the current published form version, and can help you diagnose an issue. Go ahead and close that preview. So that gives you some basic information on your form properties and pulling them from processing and instructions. The next thing let's look at is some percentage complete examples here. And we'll take a look at, I think this one was the more interesting. No, this was not. This was the more boring of the two. We'll look at both of them. So this one has a formula here as a default value in this particular text box. If you're not familiar with this syntax, that straight up and down bar is a union operator. So in this case, we're individually counting all of the fields that are equal to blank, and we're doing a little math to figure out what percentage is complete. We'll go ahead and we'll preview this. I'll just show it to you real quickly. And so we put something in there, and now we've got 1, 2, 3, we've got however many. So this will come to a certain percent complete. Okay, we've got 10. So it's 10% complete. We fill in another, it's 20. We fill in another, it's 30. So that's useful for kind of a simple form. As you can see, the rule there is, or the default value there is, it's a little clunky, right? You have to add all of your fields in your XPath filter to not being equal to blank, but it's not ridiculously bad. If you had 400 fields, it might not be exactly the way to go. We'll close this one. We'll look at one that's a little bit more sophisticated. And there's a very sophisticated one here called Expense Report Completion Progress, and that'll be included with the webcast package. We'll just design this real quick. Okay, so in this case, again, I've got a percentage complete node. And let's take a look at the values in there. And you could have done this with an expression box. Okay. All right. So in this case, what we're counting is the descendant or self nodes where the question rating is not blank, and we're dividing it by a count of all of our questions. And I'm going to cancel this briefly and expand this. Bless InfoPath's heart that it's not going to let me show you the schema while I've got that open. And let me make this a little bigger. Okay. And so now let's go look at the properties again here and look at this formula. Okay. So what we're saying is, if we edit the XPath, we're saying from where I'm at, section percentage complete, I want to go up the tree. You see those first two dots? I want to go up the tree. And after I've gone up the tree, I'm going to be selecting from the descendant or self node any questions where the question rating is not equal to blank. This gets us all of the questions, no matter how many sections or subsections there are. That's the point. We want to make sure we're getting all of the questions. And then I'm doing a count of my questions after, again, moving back up the tree and selecting all of them regardless of how many sections or subsections are inside of here. And this is the point where I wanted to show you that XPath tutorial. It's at zvon.org, and what I like about this one is when you're trying to understand a piece of XPath or a function that's unfamiliar to you. This one, for example, is for the descendant or self-access, and it explains it contains the context node and the descendants of the context node. You're like, well, whoop-de-doo, what does that mean? But if you look at it, then you can see, well, I'm saying we're going to this node, then this node, and descendant or self. And at this point, you can see all of X and everything below it is highlighted red to help you see what would have been selected. So, for example, we're saying all of the CC nodes, descendant or self, and this will select everything that's a CC node, as well as every CC node that has any children. It also selects the children. So these are the sorts of online resources that can kind of help you get your head around some of this syntax. At any rate, that covers the percentage complete here. Let's give it a quick preview and take a look. So you can see in this case we're using a percent complete for each of these different sections, and as we start completing these, our different sections get a percent complete. And you'll be able to take a closer look at this in the form template included with the webcast package, the webinar package. So next, let's look at using double eval. Double eval can be kind of challenging for folks. The syntax is a little difficult. Now, where is my double eval? I beg your pardon. Let me go find this guy. I know I had. It's complete. Maybe I put him in this one. I can't find my double eval sample. I apologize. Let's go look one more time. Actually, we'll go ahead and move on to the final thing, and then we'll go take a look back at the other form and see if I can track down the one I misplaced. So on this one for repeating tables, what I wanted to show were some things like row numbering, using position, which is only available in filler, following sibling, preceding sibling, last, and current. Current's a really important concept in InfoPath. You need to understand what current provides you when you're using XPath. Current means the node I am currently on. Now, I know that sounds so lame when I say it like that, but if you're developing a relative XPath from something, sometimes you want to indicate this one. And the instances you would use that frequently is if you are adding a filter to an XPath for a different data source. It's a way to get back to whatever data source you are currently in when you've already set up an XPath to an outside secondary data source. We'll take a look at an example of that. So in this case, unit name, this column, is my secondary data source values. You can see I've just got a bunch of values here. I've got a row number, and in this case, in this row number formula, I'm using preceding sibling. In the second column, I'm using a position formula. The position function is not available in IPFS. It's only for filler. Here I'm using a following sibling formula to get back the values. So you can see I'm on 3 east, and this is returning 3 west. Here I'm using preceding sibling. Now, needless to say, it's blank right here. We don't have a preceding sibling to the initial instance. Down here we're blank under following sibling. We don't have a following sibling to the final instance. And in this one I'm using the last function. It returns the very last. And of course current, which returns our current node. So let's take a look at some of these. Row number, we've got a calculated value. And if we go and take a look here, we're using the preceding sibling function. Now, this is an expression box that is sitting inside the unit node. It's in a secondary data source. So to access the preceding sibling, I just need to use preceding sibling and then the XPath to the node itself. And that will take me back to my initial preceding unit node. I'm using a count +1 because, as we kind of noticed with our original preceding sibling formula, if you're on the first instance, the preceding sibling is non-existent. It's blank, right? So we have to add 1 because the initial count of preceding sibling would be 0. I'll say OK, cancel out of this one. Let's take a look here. I'm so sorry, guys. I'm always running too long. I always have too much that I want to tell you. In this case, I'm using the position function. The position function is, hey, where am I? However many of these there are, I'd like to know where I am in these. So you can see we've got this repeating unit group, and position returns where you're at. Again, filler only. Here's a following sibling formula. It's just using following sibling to get back the unit name. I'm currently on unit. I say following sibling, and I want the following unit / unit name. That takes me to the next unit name. My preceding sibling unit name value looks exactly the same. It just has preceding sibling. And then here I'm using the last function. Again, filler only. You can see units, unit, and I'm getting the last one, unit name. Now I'm using a full XPath here. You can see I've started with that /, and that's because I want to go ahead and get anything. I want to get the last one in the entire tree. Okay? I could have used a relative XPath there as well. And here's the current function, and in this case I'm just using current, which refers to this particular node, and unit name. So if I were to want to set a field's value here based on using a current function. This is worthwhile. We'll do this real quick. So here's where the current function comes into play. I want to set this to unit, unit name, filter data. This is very made up, where saved is equal to my horribly named field 2. So here I am navigating back to my main data source, where it's equal to field 2. And then you say OK. And so here, if I change this to the expression, you can see InfoPath in this case used the current function for me. But it doesn't always. Sometimes it actually will go ahead and put in the entire path, including the selection of the DOM. So when you see that happen, now you know that you can replace that full path with current and the relative path to your field 2. I'm on field 3, so current refers to field 3. I'm going back up the tree, and then I'm getting field 2. Okay, and I'm just going to cancel out of all of these.
Okay, we had an interruption while recording this live meeting for this webinar. So what I'm doing is I'm just redoing the final 10 minutes of it and splicing it together. I apologize for the little hiccup there in the middle of everything. So the last two examples I'd like to talk about are conditional defaults and using double eval. So these are two more ways we can use XPath to do some things we might not otherwise be able to do. Now, what do I mean when I'm talking about a conditional default? Well, a conditional default would be if we were able in InfoPath to say, if the value of something is something, then I want the value of this to be X. Otherwise, I want the value of this to be Y. So it's a little hard to explain. I've got a sample here in this text box, and I want to show you briefly this blog post. It's the Microsoft InfoPath team blog post. You can see this post was from quite a while back, November 27th, 2006, and it's on conditional default values. Now the method I'm about to show you is this second one. We're using concat, substring, and string length. And you can see they've written out here basically what the logic is. We're concatenating two substrings. One substring is going to return 0 characters. The other substring will return all of its characters. When we concatenate these two values, then we'll have one entire substring and one substring will be entirely missing. So let me show you how that plays out here in my form. Now I'm going to warn you that my concat formula here is maybe a little bit silly, because what I'm doing here is in the instance where my value field is equal to 1, then I'm setting this field named default to value times quantity. And in the instance when my value is not equal to 1, then I'm setting this field default to quantity minus value. Okay, so let's take a look at each of these substring functions. Now remember, our point here is that each of these substring functions, only one of them should return a value, and it should return all of its characters. So the first argument in a substring function is, whoops, I keep doing that. The first argument in a substring function is, what do you want to get the substring of? So in my first substring, I'm saying I want the substring of this formula of value times quantity. The second argument is, what character should I start at? And in this case, we're starting at the first character, because if our condition is true, we want all of the characters. The final argument in a substring formula is, how many characters should I return? So you can see I've got another formula here to indicate how many characters to return. The first portion of my formula is the statement I'd like to evaluate. Value equals 1. It's in parentheses. It's going to return true or false. Value is equal to 1 or it is not equal to 1. If it returns true, then the value of value equals 1 is going to be true, or 1. If this returns false, the value of value equals 1 is going to be false, or 0. Okay? Now what happens if I multiply 0 by another number? I get 0. So 0 times 4 is 0. 0 times 82 is 0. I mean, this is the kind of math I'm good at. And what happens if I multiply 1 by another number? It returns the number itself. So 1 times 4 is 4. 1 times 82 is 82. Okay, so what's happening here is I'm getting the string length of my initial formula. Okay, so let's say value times quantity is 5 characters for whatever reason, right? And I'm multiplying it by either 1 or 0. If this condition is true, I'll return all of the characters of this first substring. If this condition is false, I'll return 0 characters of the first substring. So now we look at our second substring, and the first thing we've got here is we've got our formula, which in this case is quantity minus value. That's the string I want a portion of. Now remember, we already know I'm either going to return all or none of these characters, okay? And 1 is the character that I'm going to start returning characters at. That's my initiator there in my substring. And then finally the last portion is telling me how many characters to return. So the first thing you'll notice is this formula here is exactly the opposite of this formula here. One of these formulas will be true and the other formula will be false. And one formula will always be true and the other formula will always be false. Okay, so value is either going to be equal to 1 or value is going to be not equal to 1. So one of these formulas will return a 1 and one of these formulas will return a 0. And again, for my string length formula, I'm just using the same formula I used up here for my substring. I'm going to show this to you, and since our meeting recording went to who knows where, and I'm redoing this portion of the meeting, I'm going to do a little bit of a better job of it than I did in the webinar, because we're going to walk through this formula a second time, okay? Because this is actually extremely useful. Believe it or not. I know you right now you're thinking, oh yeah, you're crazy. Okay, so let me just show this to you real quick. And we'll say okay. And we're going to just give it a quick preview. I'll get this resized a little bit here. Okay, so remember, if value is equal to 1, default is going to equal value times quantity. If value is not equal to 1, then default is going to equal quantity minus value. So in this case, value is not equal to 1, and if I change quantity to 23, you can see my conditional default is now equal to 21. If I change this to 3, all of a sudden my conditional default is going to be taking quantity minus value, right? And it's going to change to 1. If I change this to 200, right, we're going to have a 200 over there in the conditional default. Okay, so that is in general how this works. And let's just do another little quick change. Let's modify that formula. So let's say that instead of using a formula like this, I wanted to use an actual string. Happy Thursday. So if value is equal to 1, then I'm going to want to return this. So that means here I need to get the string length of my actual string. Right? So I type out my full string. So my logic is still the same here. I'm saying, look, if value is equal to 1, I want that field to say Happy Thursday. And then in this case, I'm going to say if value is not equal to 1, we're going to make that be Happy Friday. And again, you know, we've got value not equal to 1. It's going to return a 1 or a 0. We're going to multiply it by the string length of the string we've entered. Right? And we'll say okay, and then we'll just go preview this again. And because it's a default, you know, I don't have to go setting rules on multiple fields. So let's just take a quick preview. Okay, and so you can see we've got Happy Thursday, Happy Friday. We changed this to 15 and it's going to change to Happy Friday. Now the place where I used this was on, one of the places I've used this was on an estimate form where the function used for a total field was if the item was a material item, like a product that was being resold, then one formula was used. And if the item was a labor item, it was somebody installing or using the material, then another formula was used. And because there were several fields involved in each of these formulas, I would have had to set a multiplicity of rules in order to get the same functionality. So instead I used this conditional default functionality. I did find in some instances an occasional performance hitch with this. So if you're using this deep within some nested repeating tables on a form that's got a data source where multiple lines will be entered, be sure you performance test a little with it and make sure you see what the implications are. I don't recommend against it at all. I'm just saying be aware that I have seen some performance hits, so you'll want to be careful with that. Now, in the original webinar, for some reason, I could not remember that I'd given this view a very silly name. Initially, what I was going to show you was a combination of the double eval formula that was also using that concat formula and that conditional default. And the reason I did not show you that is because it's just as easy to add a filter to your double eval formula. And if I recall correctly, there was a time early in InfoPath 2000 2007 where there was still a bug and you couldn't necessarily add a filter in a double eval formula. But I think by Service Pack 1 even in 2007 that was cleared up. So combining double eval with that concatenate conditional default probably isn't ever necessary. However, that doesn't mean you won't ever want to add a filter to a double eval. So let's go ahead and just preview this guy real quick and we'll talk a little bit about this. Now, the double eval statement is often used to kind of group things up. So let's just say that in this form we've got an email connection and we want to set the email to go to all of the people here who are selected, right? Now, in my double eval alone, you can see I've got everyone. But in this one, where I'm marking people and unmarking people, I just get the ones that are selected. So let's go take a look at how that's done, okay? And so your basic double eval alone, if we look at the properties, let's go take a look. Okay, so the first thing that we pick here, the group, go ahead and pick that using insert field or group. But this piece right here, where we're doing the concat, etc., we select, we type that in, and in this case my my field is called email. If you were wondering what your field was called, of course you can click insert field or group and take a look, and here's mine, and it's called email. Now, once again, this is a tip that originated with the Microsoft InfoPath team on their blog. And so if we scroll down a little on this tip, we can see how it's working. Okay, so the inside portion of the formula, where we've got the concat and the my email, that adds a semicolon to each email address. So let's take a quick look at our form and see the piece we're talking about here. Now, this bit is going to add our semicolon to each email address. If you were wanting to use the double eval on a different field, you would change the name of this field right here. If your main data source used a different namespace prefix, you would change it here. But this again is not selected using the field selector. If we click Edit XPath here, you can see that this is just, it's its own little string. It's all wrapped up in single quotes there, right? Okay, and so that adds a semicolon to each email address. Now the next portion, where we do the initial eval with our repeating group, and we've got a closing parenthesis here, this loops through each person in their instance. This loops through each of your repeating nodes in a more generic fashion to create a list of email addresses. Okay, so if we go back to our form here, and let me deselect this so it's just a little cleaner to look at. So eval right through there, that guy is just selecting all of our, it's looping through our parent nodes, group 2, to get all of our email addresses, right? And back we go. And finally, the last portion of the string gets the anonymous parent of the email addresses and converts them to a string. So the end result returns the contents of the anonymous parent, which is a series of semicolon delimited email addresses. Now, how do we add the filter to this, right? Here we've got this guy. He does what we want. He's a pretty simple, I mean, you can pretty much copy and paste this formula, and all you've got to do is just replace that group with your repeating group, and instead of my email, type in whatever your field is, and if you want something other than a semicolon, put it there. It is very easy to reuse this formula, right? But what if you want to do something special? Like in our case, we want to only display the ones that have been selected because our email data connection uses this email to field. So let's go take a look at that. Okay, and so all I did was I added a filter right there to my group. So when you insert your field or group, you've got your ability to filter data, and you can just say filter and add it there. You don't even have to handwrite the XPath. Now mind you, it's always a good idea to take a look at the XPath, and you can see how simple that is. You know, it's just group 2, and then right here inside of group 2, my include is equal to true. And that is how that works. At any rate, again, sorry for kind of the hiccupy presentation here that we went from live meeting audio to hopefully some slightly better audio. I hadn't realized how bad the live meeting stuff was. And I hope you have a great day. Thanks.